It was the first morning of June, 1781, and the sky above New York was a calm, unbroken blue. Sunlight filtered through the oak leaves, falling like soft gold onto the still surface of the village lake at Milton's Ridge. Children laughed and shouted along the muddy banks, throwing pebbles into the water, watching the ripples dance. A red-haired boy, youngest of the Miller clan, jostled another child for the smoothest stone, while little Emma Whittaker giggled uncontrollably as her dress caught water from a splashing rock. The slow clatter of horse hooves echoed along the dirt road, stirring up dust that swirled gently in the morning light. The scent of dry straw mingled with wildflowers and morning dew from the open meadows, creating that particular perfume known only to farming villages at the cusp of summer. Out near the southern fields, old Jonas, one of the village's longest living residents, stood with two younger men, speaking in quiet tones about this year's wheat crop. "The low soil's damp early this year. I fear the wheat'll bloom before time," one of the men muttered, wiping his brow and glancing skyward. "But if the old calendars are right," Jonas said, his voice like bark peeling from an old tree, "we'll have light rain before Sunday." The wind passed through the birch trees lining the edge of the square, and the leaves rustled in a way that almost sounded like whispered words. Milton's Ridge was a small, unassuming village tucked between low hills and whispering woods, north of Albany. About 40 homes stood scattered in a loose circle around a cobblestone square, where an ancient well and a whitewashed wooden chapel stood. Generations had lived and died in this quiet place. Family names were tied to land and stories: Hutchinson, Martin, Warner, like tree roots sunk deep into fertile soil. Nobody needed to ask a child's name as they ran past. A glance at their stride or their hair was enough to know where they belonged. Everyone knew everyone: birthdays, crops, marriages, debts. And yet, as June arrived each year, a peculiar silence began to spread across the conversations. Tessie Hutchinson stepped out from the doorway of her pale blue house, sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned hastily. She wasn't the prettiest woman in the village, but there was something in the way she moved through the morning light, brisk, focused, her eyes alive, that made her unforgettable. "Bill, are you going to fix the chicken coop today or wait until harvest?" she called back through the open door, placing a basket of warm bread on the porch rail and wiping her hands on her apron. Her husband, Bill Hutchinson, emerged from behind the side wall, tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet bearing of a man long accustomed to work and silence. Their two children, Billy and Sarah, knelt near the garden path, sorting dried petals and bits of grass into neat piles, a game of their own making. The Hutchinsons weren't wealthy, nor were they particularly notable, but they were respected. Bill worked the western field with steady diligence. Tessie volunteered at the chapel and delivered bread to the village nursery. They were what anyone would call a good family, ordinary, in the most comforting way. By mid-morning, the sunlight crept higher, falling upon the worn stones at the heart of the square. At the center, a black wooden box sat on a raised slab, draped in cloth. Mr. Summers, the man in charge of village events, paced slowly around it, inspecting every detail: the flagpole, the wooden table, the attendance list. Everything had to be precise. After all, the drawing only happened once a year. Old Jonas sat beneath the tall elm by the square, watching. His eyes didn't blink often anymore. He wasn't afraid, nor hopeful, just tired. "I remember the first time I drew. I was 12. He muttered to no one in particular. "Back then, we used goat parchment instead of paper." A young woman nearby caught the comment and hesitated mid-step, but she quickly turned away, resuming her task of brushing her daughter's hair as if she had heard nothing at all. Tessie passed through the square, basket in hand, heading toward the chapel. Her eyes caught the shape beneath the black cloth. Just for a moment, her face changed, like a shadow passed through her thoughts. "Mrs. Hutchinson." Mr. Summers greeted her with a cordial nod. "Mr. Summers," she returned, keeping her voice light. though her fingers gripped the basket a little too tightly as the sun climbed. A different kind of air began to settle over Milton's ridge. No one said anything directly. But every glance, every gesture carried the weight of quiet anticipation. A mother pulled her daughter quickly inside their cottage, whispering, "Don't forget the shawl." Mr. Graves, the village scribe, hurried along the square, flipping through his notebook as though fearing an omission. From the way he paused and counted silently, it was clear he was making sure no name had been left out. Tessie stopped by Warner's General Store to buy seeds. The old man, stooped, white-haired, half-blind, recognized her immediately. "June's come again," he said with a slow nod. "It has," Tessie replied, hesitating. "Have you ever wished we didn't have to draw?" The old man was silent for a long while, gazing at the dusty ceiling. Then he said, "I did. When I was your age. I did." Back home, Tessie found Bill sharpening a shovel. The children were still playing, but they had stayed closer to the house now. She sat on the steps, rubbing her arm absently. "I saw Mr. Summers checking the box," she said without looking at him. Bill nodded but said nothing, his hands steady against the whetstone. "They always check the day before," he said finally. "And no one ever asks why." He paused, then looked up. "Tessie, it's the law. It's always been this way. Even before our grandparents' time." Tessie looked out toward the lake, where the children's laughter had softened to murmurs. "If it's me, would you?" "Don't," Bill said sharply, his tone heavier than his words. She fell quiet. A breeze rolled through, catching the edge of her apron. The chapel bell rang softly in the distance. No one truly spoke about what would happen tomorrow, but everyone knew. The midday sun cast slanting shadows across the ancient stone slabs of the central square. The early June heat of that year wasn't harsh, but strong enough to make people squint as they stepped out of their homes. Doors opened one by one. Figures emerged, men in coarse linen shirts, women with scarves tied over their heads, children clinging to their mothers' skirts. As with every year, the entire village of Milton's Ridge turned toward one fixed point, the black box at the center of the square. A festival with no flowers, no music, only a wooden box and silence. The black box, old and battered, was covered in coarse grey cloth and placed on a low wooden table. It was no bigger than a chest, but there was something about it that made people unable to look away. The wood had worn thin with age, its corners lightly cracked, and dark smudges marked its lower edge. No one ever asked what they were. Mr. Summers, the man in charge of the ceremony, stood beside the box, list in hand, scanning the silent crowd. "Mrs. Martin," he called out. "Here." A middle-aged woman stepped forward. Mr. Summers didn't speak loudly, but each word landed like a stone on granite. Tessie stood within the crowd, head slightly bowed, arms folded, her palm already damp with sweat. She hadn't even realized. Tessie's mind, hoping it's not her, but afraid to hope too much. "I hate this feeling," Tessie thought. "I laughed when Martha Martin's hand shook last year, and now I'm the one trembling." Next to her, Bill stood tall, silent. His hands were deep in his pockets, but Tessie could see his thumb twitching faintly. Only she noticed. Sarah clung to the hem of her mother's dress, eyes wide. Billy tried to peek up toward the box, as if it might contain some kind of game in a place where there was no fun at all. "I don't want to draw." No one does. But no one says it out loud. The smallest sounds, falling leaves, passing wind, restrained breath. Wind swept through the pine trees near the square, loosening a few dry needles. They spun gently, slowly falling to the stone. Someone cleared their throat. The shuffle of a shoe over gravel. The faint scratch of paper as Mr. Graves recorded names already drawn. No drums. No laughter. Only the quietest of sounds, and because of that, each one echoed louder in the mind. Tessie glanced at the box. It hadn't been opened yet. Families would step up one by one, represented by the husband, Who would draw a slip of paper? Only one. No one could open their slip until everyone had drawn. That was the rule. The white papers. And one marked in black. Mr. Summers lifted the lid of the box. Inside were over 40 slips of folded paper. Only one was marked. Everyone knew that. The marked slip bore no writing. No number. Just a black mark. Drawn by hand. And whoever held it? The Hutchinson family. Mr. Summers said. Tessie's heart clenched. Bill stepped forward. One step. Then another. Slow. As if he were walking across thin ice. He said nothing. Tessie wanted to call out to him. To say something. But her throat had turned to dust. Bill reached into the box. Mr. Summers watched him closely but said nothing. No instruction. No rush. The moment Bill's fingers touched the papers, the air seemed to vanish. He drew a slip and folded it tight in his hand. The papers remain unopened, all eyes locked in. Every villager now held a slip of paper. Each one clenched tightly in hand. No one was allowed to unfold theirs yet. The old law said, not until every hand held a paper. A kind of fairness, or a cruel way to prolong the dread. Mr. Summers took a deep breath. That's everyone, he said. Open them. The sound of unfolding paper rose like the fluttering of butterflies in a midnight forest. Tessie looked at Bill. His eyes were fixed on his paper. He opened it. For a moment, Bill stood still, unmoving, like stone. Then, slowly, he looked up, and turned his gaze toward Tessie. The black mark. Tessie stepped back. The air around her froze. No one spoke. The square went still. Even the children stopped playing. Old Jonas leaned on his cane. Lowered his head. Tessie. Bill called quietly. Almost a whisper. No, she said, shaking her head. Eyes wide. No. Not me. It's not fair. The rules are rules, Mr. Graves said. His voice not loud, but unyielding. It's not fair, Tessie cried louder now. I was late. I didn't even get to, I didn't think. Mr. Summers furrowed his brow. Tessie. This process has been the same for hundreds of years. You know that. No one touched Tessie, but they all turned away. No one stepped forward to hold her. No one needed to. The next step was the second draw, only within the Hutchinson family. 5 slips. One for each family member. Whoever held the black mark now would be chosen. Tessie began to cry. No. Please, has anyone ever thought of stopping this? Has anyone ever questioned it? No one answered. Bill looked at Tessie. He didn't cry. He didn't lower his gaze. He didn't embrace her. He stood silent. Just like every man in every year before him. The second draw, each slip like a sentence. Mr. Summers folded 5 new slips of paper. No one saw which bore the mark. He placed them back into the box. Begin. Sarah drew first. Her tiny hand shaking. Billy followed. Then Tessie. Bill. And finally, little Timmy. Once more, they all held papers. Now, open them. Tessie opened hers. A black mark. Drawn in charcoal. Large. Clear. What did I ever do? Tessie's last question. She fell to her knees. Trembling. The paper slipped from her fingers. What did I ever do? She whispered. As if someone, some hidden figure behind the veil of tradition, might still have mercy. No one answered. Mr. Graves retrieved the box. Mr. Summers nodded. The men began to pick up stones, already gathered in piles from the early morning, stacked in the corner of the square. Tessie watched them. Despair written across her face. Falling leaves. Steady sunlight. The first stone struck her shoulder. The second, her back. The children weren't allowed to participate. As with every year, they were led away. Bill stood in the back. He didn't throw. But he didn't stop anyone either. Tessie collapsed. Blood seeped onto the stone. A gasp. A sob. Then silence. The box was covered once more. The list closed. That's another year done, Mr. Summers said. Turning away, the wind swept through the pine again. Leaves fell. The sun kept shining. Life in Milton's Ridge went on. The moment the black slip was revealed, Time seemed to shatter in that frozen instant. Faces among the villagers went from neutral to alarm. Some widened their eyes in disbelief, others stiffened. Lips pressed into thin lines. Children, momentarily confused, looked between their parents. A suffocating silence draped over the square, oppressive as a tomb. A few quick glances passed between neighbors, a tightened jaw here, a clenched fist there. The calm that had blanketed the morning evaporated. In its place rose a cold, grim resolution. The familiar, ritual-sharing hush now carried an undercurrent of menace. Tessie's voice trembled as she cried out, "No. Please, you don't have to do this." Her hand reached toward Bill, her 2 tears-misted children clung to her skirts. Bill stepped forward, arms outstretched. "Tessie. Stop, just stop." His voice shook more than his wife's. Billy and Sarah pressed into his side, their small hands gripping fabric as though they could anchor the moment. The crowd parted slightly, eyes locked on Tessie. But no one advanced. They stood firm, organic barricades of flesh and wood, rooted by ritual and fear. Bill shouted once more, but the distance between them felt infinite. "I won't. I can't." Tessie howled, voice cracking. Overhead, the sun moved, oblivious. The wind stirred fallen pine needles between worn stones. Each drifting leaf seemed to whisper, "This is how it must be." Then, movement, slow, deliberate, like dominoes tipping. John Warner, neighbor and childhood friend, stooped and picked up a stone from the pile gathered since dawn. The rock, about the size of a fist, was rough and cool. He adjusted his grip, knuckles paling, then looked once more at Tessie at center circle. His expression held no joy, only commitment. Then the first stone flew. The violence. It hit Tessie's right shoulder like a thunderclap. She gasped, shoulders hunching. For a moment, she froze, half expecting others to stop. They did not. A second stone struck her back, a harsh crack of bone against rock. Tessie screamed, a high, broken sound that seemed to reverberate off the stone buildings. Bill surged forward, trying to push past the line. "Stop this. Stop it now." His orders came out as half-words. Tessie staggered, gripping him as blood blossomed under her blouse. But the villagers closed ranks. They, too, picked stones. Mother after father, son after daughter, each found a weight in the morning's pile. Even old Jonas, frail but certain, raised a hand and let his stone fly. He didn't strike her hard, but sent it with the same intent as everyone else. Ritual completed. Fear exorcised. A rock landed on Tessie's thigh. Another on her arm, her back, her calf. Each impact burst warmth across her skin. The air rang with dull thuds, the hiss of stone slicing through air, and a dripping that blended with words and sobs. Tessie's vision blurred. She looked at Bill, attempting a defiant reach. He flinched himself, stepping back, torn between instinct and tradition. Their eyes met, hers wide with appeal, his clouded with despair. Neither blinked. Then Tessie, collapsing to her knees, whispered in a strangled voice, "Why? Why won't you stop?" The question echoed in the quiet stones. But no one spoke. No one answered. The families rolled through the haze. Sarah and Billy watched unseen, led away to sit on the chapel steps. They huddled together, hands clasped, whispering that it was just a game, that it would stop. But it didn't. Bill knelt beside Tessie, shroud of grief concealed in his stiff body. He didn't throw. He didn't touch her. All he did was fold his arms, as though pressing himself into pact with the proceedings. To him, tradition outweighed heartache. And in Milton's Ridge, tradition was law. The finale. Stone number 6 struck Tessie's left shoulder. She uttered a final, strangled cry. The last beat of her heart rattled once. And then nothing. Silence returned, a low, rumbling hush passing through the villages like the final chord after a symphony. The wind stirred the pine needles yet again. A single leaf drifted across the blood-soaked stone. it settled. Settling like a punctuation mark on horror. Mr. Summers closed the black box with deliberate care. Then placed the lid back in position. Mr. Graves flipped closed the ledger. His pen dropping with a soft click. Bill stood, shattered, as though woken from a dream of steel. He brushed blood from his hands and walked through the circle of crowd. Eyes dropped. Roads parted for him. He spoke no word as he stepped past the red stain. Another year done, Mr. Summers announced. Quietly. The voice was calm, neutral as a clergyman. One by one, villagers dispersed. Men gathered stones into sacks. Women slipped cloth over Tessie's form, muttering prayers that sounded less like comfort and more like absolution. The aftermath. The square was swept free of stones and fibers. Rocks collected and stored for next year. The black box returned to its dusty shelf in the chapel annex. Children were hustled back to their chores. Adults sought to fill the morning's silence with rationed polite talk about the wheat, the well, or the days till harvest. Flakes of pine and grit swirled in the sheen of sunshine. No one spoke of what had just happened, at least not in front of strangers. But behind closed doors, the whispers began. Well, we did it. We kept it going. It's tradition. Someone replied. Same as always. And beyond each home's latch, a memory darkened the hearth, the memory of Tessie Hutchinson, whose life was claimed not for any foul act, but simply for being the one who drew the mark.